Okay, so chapter 1, the science of psychology. Listen, I'm going to try to do sort of a brief overview. You've got these PowerPoints and they'll be up there for y'all to look through more thoroughly. I also encourage y'all to read the chapter. Please read the chapter. That's really important. But I'm going to kind of hit a few high points as we walk through this, and I'll be kind of pointing out some things and going a little more in depth if I can here and there. The science of psychology chapter begins by defining psychology, reviewing the history of the field, also survey the broad perspectives, 7 perspectives we'll talk about that are relevant today. Then we'll also look at the scientific method. How do we do research? How do we conduct research? What are some of the important methods and different standards we use? Kinds of research that psychologists do, whether that's in natural settings or laboratory settings. We'll explore that a little bit. Also, ethical guidelines. That's something that's really important today. Didn't always used to be, and the standards weren't always really strict. Nowadays, do no harm, protect participants, participant rights, really a big deal. And then it concludes with a look at the applications of psychology to daily life, which is really the central focus of the book. And you'll see this element coming up in most chapters where there's apply it to your life, apply it to what's going on with you, which I think is cool about this textbook because it makes it a little more relevant. Looking at the chapter preview, scientific study of behavior and mental processes, that is your, basically in a nutshell, your definition of psychology. The key terms: science, behavior, mental processes. And yes, we're trying to, as it says, the goals of psychology are to describe, predict, explain behavior. In addition, psychologists are often interested in controlling or changing behavior, and they use scientific methods to examine interventions that might help, for example, reducing violence or rather promoting happiness. Your behavior, everything that we can directly observe. This is important to behavioral psychology, behaviorists. They really put a lot of stock into what we can see playing out right in front of us. Something that we can record, we can measure. They feel like it's more reliable. And then mental processes, your thinking, feelings, motives that each of us experience, and private thoughts, which we cannot observe. We have to go on self-report, basically what comes from you. The attitudes of the scientific method: critical thinking, curiosity, skepticism, and objectivity. These are pretty important. Obviously, critical thinking, process of thinking deeply and actively, asking questions, evaluating the evidence. That's what I want you guys to do in some of the other activities throughout this course too. When there's a discussion board up there, I want you to do critical thinking. And I want you to apply all these elements actually, but critical thinking is really important. Curiosity, we often do research in areas that we're curious about. Skepticism, a healthy level of questioning. Even things you assume to be true, being somewhat skeptical and asking questions. Objectivity, this is basically, can I approach something without being biased? Can I maintain objectivity? Being a marriage and family therapist, y'all, I'll have friends or family members ask me, Craig, how do you analyze this? And I'll say, I don't. I'm emotionally attached to you guys. I'm the worst psychologist for you. So you lose objectivity when you're personally invested or involved. That's why we're not good at diagnosing our own family members or even diagnosing ourselves. That's really a no-no. Science of the human behavior. It is a diverse field, y'all. A lot of people come into Intro to Psychology and they assume that it's about mental disorders and psychological disorders. But that's just actually 2 chapters. Chapter 12, Chapter 13 focus more on psychological disorders and the treatment for it. So there's many other fields of psychology and disciplines within psychology. We'll explore that, take a look at it. Understanding truths of the human life in all of its dimensions includes people's best and worst experiences. And this is from 2006, a tragedy that took place in the Amish community. And it basically highlights how the Amish were so quick to forgive and so quick to extend forgiveness even to the murderer's family. And you can kind of read about that in the red down here. It kind of gives a description briefly of what happened, and it's hard to comprehend that sometimes. Some of the things that people do that are on the horrible side, we can't comprehend that. But even some of the good things and heroic things, it's hard to step into. Here's the fields of psychology, settings in which psychologists work, rather. You've got a breakdown there. Clinical is a big portion, 24. Academics big, 34. Private practice. Academic, hence teaching, kind of what I'm doing. I fall within the academic area of that. Although at Delgado, we're pretty much more of a teaching institution. We're not a research-based institution. There's some research going on, but not much. Where other four-year colleges, universities, you'll find a lot of people working in academia that are strictly involved in research and don't even teach much. Some of them do, but once they've been there, once they're tenured, they move into research areas. And clinical psychology, service delivery. These are people like psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, therapists that are working with patients and clients and using modalities and treatments to try to help them with whatever they're dealing with or coping with. So the historical perspective, where did psychology start? Ancient myths attributed most important events to the pleasure or displeasure of the gods. When a volcano erupted, the gods were angry. If two people fell in love, they had been struck by Cupid's arrows. So we kind of move from that into what we kind of acknowledge today as our roots, and that's philosophy, the rational investigation of underlying principles of being and knowledge. People tended to explain events in terms of natural rather than supernatural causes. They also looked at theology a lot. There were theologians that people turned to try to answer these big questions of human life and explaining it in relation to God or in relation to something that was difficult to comprehend. Western philosophy came of age in ancient Greece, 4th, 5th centuries BC. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle were very influential, debated the nature of thought and behavior, including the possible link between the mind and body, which was, we look at that today. Mind-body connection, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of scientifically validated support for this connection. And they were talking about it in the 4th and 5th centuries. That's really pretty cool. Psychology grew out of this tradition of thinking about the mind and body. The influence of philosophy on contemporary psychologists persists today. Hence, PhD. We still have folks that get doctorates in philosophy, specializing in psychology. We also have PsyDs, which is a doctorate in psychology, which is becoming more common and is used more in clinical programs. So structuralism, you can see this dude down here, Wilhelm Wundt, that's my best German pronunciation I can provide, established the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany, 1879. That's when he kind of put psychology on the map. And you can see in the green here, this is kind of significant. What made this method scientific was the systematic, detailed self-reports required of the person in a controlled laboratory setting. So that was special, and introspection was what they used. And basically, some of y'all that are into music maybe use a metronome or have used a metronome for rhythm and so forth. They were introspecting as the ticking went back and forth. They were encouraged to share their thoughts and share their feelings. And so they would have people in a laboratory setting simply share their thoughts as you heard the tick, tick, tick back and forth of the metronome. We call it structuralism. You won't hear about it today, but this was how it kind of got things rolling. Functionalism was sort of a reaction to structuralism. William James, American psychologist, 1842 to 1910, identified the purposes or the functions of the mind. He was the guy that kind of brought it across the pond to the U.S. and started a lab at Cornell University. And James had a view that was more adaptive. He said, what can we do with this? It's interesting to kind of let people introspect, hear about their thoughts, but how is that adaptive? How does it work? How does that stream of thought, how does that help us? And so that's what William James was trying to get at. Is adaptive. We're concerned with how it makes an organism better able to survive. And they borrowed from Darwin, natural selection, theory of evolution was important, and William James really picked up on this, and he liked what Darwin was doing, so he kind of borrowed some of Darwin's theories and pulled it into functionalism. The natural selection, the process by which environment determines who wins that competition. That's over here in the blue. And the adaptive nature of human characteristics. How does it make things adaptive? It's as example, this principle applies to taking an antibiotic medication, down here in the green, at first sign of a sore throat or an earache. By killing off the bacteria that may be causing the illness, you are creating an environment where their competitors, so-called antibiotic-resistant bacteria, may flourish. These observations powerfully demonstrate Darwinian selection in action. So we're moving into the contemporary approaches, and these are what are important today: biological, behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, evolutionary, also sociocultural. Used to be called schools, now we call them more perspectives. And people used to be really pure in their school of psychology, or their perspective. For example, you've got the behaviorist, or the biological approach, focus on the brain and nervous system. And this is coming on strong today. It's continued to, as technology has come into the picture. Functional MRIs are allowing us to peer into the brain and really look at what's going on with different structures and blood flows. Neuroscience has come on strong. And I think you're going to see a lot of advances in this field as we kind of move into the future, next 10, 20 years. I think neuroscience is going to unlock some of these brains of the mystery. Mystery of the brains. Dyslexic slip there. Which I think is really going to be cool, because I look at the brain as the last frontier. We know everything about the physical body, but there's so much we don't know in terms of neurotransmitters and discovering new neurotransmitters, etc. It's going to be interesting what will happen. Behavioral approach. You can see Watson over there on the right. I don't always scare babies, but when I do, it's for psychology. Watson was famous for his experiment with little Albert, where he took an 11-month infant, supposedly an orphan, and used something called conditioning, and conditioned Albert, and we'll talk about this in another chapter, but conditioned Albert to be afraid of things he shouldn't have been afraid of. Highly unethical by today's standards, but it made him famous, and he left psychology eventually and made a lot of money in advertising using his behavioral approaches and his classical conditioning to basically develop early TV advertising campaigns, which are around today. Commercials you see on TV today are a result of Watson's work, and he did very well, made a lot of money working in advertising, left academia behind. Emphasis on observable behavioral responses and environmental determinants up here. And then Skinner, we'll talk about Skinner. He's down here with his pigeons. He did a lot of work with Skinner boxes and training animals and showing that we can condition animals to behave in certain ways. We can change behavior. We can alter behavior through classical conditioning and operant conditioning techniques. The psychodynamic approach, there's some of y'all, if you know anybody in psychology, you might know of Sigmund Freud. Freud was the founding father of the psychodynamic approach. Not to be confused with Wilhelm Wundt. He was the father of psychology, the guy we saw earlier in Structuralism. Freud is the father of psychodynamic. Emphasis is on unconscious impulses, conflict between biological drives and society, childhood, family experiences. Practitioners of the approach believe sexual and aggressive impulses are buried deep within the unconscious. We'll talk a lot more about Freud. He'll come up. But the idea here was the unconscious, what we're unaware of, what we don't know about ourselves. He felt like it influences behavior. It influences things that we do, how we think, relationships we get into. He was influential. And we'll talk about some of the problems with Freud's theories as well. Humanistic approach. Emphasis on positive human qualities, capacity for positive growth. You've got freedom to choose any destination. Listen, this was a big deal to them. They felt like, listen, people are born good or just neutral. They're not born bad. They're not born evil. They felt like they have free will, and at any point in their adult lives, they can make changes. They can change behavior if they'd like to. Carl Rogers was very influential in clinical areas. Maslow came up with something called the hierarchy of needs, where he talked about enlightenment, or not necessarily enlightenment, but reaching the very pinnacle of his triangle, which was self-actualization. We'll talk more about that in I think it's chapter 5 or 6. So anyways, that is part 1, and I'm going to come back and